Let's talk about how smart our current breed of large language models are getting. Just by way of background, for those that need a reminder, I've got a pretty heavy context in human intelligence. I was chairman of Mensa International's Gifted Families. I consulted to ABC's Making Child Prodigies documentary, which was 6 very high-performing, high-ability children doing amazing things, including appearing with the Australian Prime Minister for that series. Also consulted to departments of education around the world, including writing acceleration reports that interpreted IQ tests for education providers. Consultant and test design for Child Genius by Warner Brothers. And more recently, we put together the concept for the BASIS AI Superintelligence Benchmark. Now let's put it all together with my latest visualization. I've called this Frontier Models, IQ versus MMLU versus MMLU-Pro versus GPQA. This is all August 2024 only. It will all change next month, and we'll have some updates on that, so we'll be able to see some movement on the latest frontier models as they pop up. But let's start with IQ, and then we've got an IQ chart here on the left, starting at the 98th percentile. It's an IQ of about 130, going through the 99th and 99.9th percentile, takes us up to about an IQ of 160. We lose a bit of resolution after that, but we've got some examples of people who have been at those particular IQ levels. Let's also have a look at where LLMs fit into IQ. We've got testing from GPT 3.5 Turbo. We know that that sits at about an IQ score of 147. We also know GPT-4, the original classic model, the huge 1.76 trillion parameter model, has an IQ of about 155. So we've got 2 very distinct measurements of large language models already mapped to IQ, and both of those large language models also have MMLU and GPQA scores. So that helps us correlate what's going on between all these different benchmarks. Let's put some real humans on here. Research shows us that those with doctorates have an IQ about 120 to 130. Let's lump them in there. And just for fun, let's put Professor Albert Einstein's head in there. We never tested his IQ, but it's generally agreed that he had an IQ in the 99.9th percentile. About 160 would be his score. Let's add some other reference points here. We'll throw in some more vertical axes. We'll start with the MMLU, Massive Multitask Language Understanding. It's about 16,000 multiple choice questions, A, B, C, or D, that span 57 academic subjects. It's a little bit old now, and it's also a little bit controversial because its error rate is so high. I'm going to put its ceiling here as 90%. Anything above that is too error prone, so if models are not scoring above that, it might be that they're actually smarter than the test. This is the concern right now. We'll also add an additional vertical axis here for the MMLU-Pro benchmark. This is 12,000 questions spanning 14 domains, but the difference here is that the multi-choice is far harder. We've increased ABCD to ABCDEFGHIJ for the models to choose from. That's 10 multiple choice answers to choose from, and it's a lot more difficult for these models to get right. Let's add a final benchmark. This is my favorite at the moment. It's the Google Proof question and answer benchmark. It's about 400 or 500 questions, depending on which subset you use. It's a lot harder. It was designed by PhDs for PhD specialists. And in fact, you can see there, the human PhD scoring just 34% on the Google Proof question and answer, the GPQA there. Let's start mapping in our other models now that we've got these 4 different vertical axes to play with, and they correlate pretty closely together. This is a very rough interpretation or mapping of the 4 different benchmarks together, and this is where the other models sit. Let's start with Llama 2 from Meta last year. At 70 billion parameters, it was just above chance in its score on the GPQA. It got 26.26. Obviously, chance with A, B, C, or D to choose from would be 25. and it has a pretty low MMLU score there as well, 68.9%, just below our starting point for this visualization. Let's add all the recent Google models from Gemini Ultra, the massive 2 trillion parameter model, up through Flash, which was tiny, rumored to be just a few billion parameters, but still performing very well, and Gemini 1.5 Pro there. You can see the MMLU scores and GPQA scores on each of these frontier models as they appear. We'll add the rest of OpenAI's most recent models. It includes GPT-4 Turbo, GPT-4o, and the recent GPT-4o Mini, said to be 8 billion parameters and still outperforming massive models like Gemini Ultra, GPT-4 Classic, both around 2 trillion parameters, being outperformed by Mini 8B on multiple benchmarks. Really interesting to see that the smaller models are now outperforming the larger models with whatever secret sauce Google and OpenAI are using. Here's a few more, starting with Amazon Titan, 200 billion parameters, some of the Chinese models from Qwen through to E extra large, and the very recent Grok 2 just came out this week, scoring 56 on the Google Proof question and answer benchmark and 87.5 on the MMLU, just below our ceiling. Here's another one, the massive Llama 3.1 405B, scoring pretty high on both benchmarks there. And here we've got Claude 2.1 progressing to Claude 3 Opus. And you'll note that Claude 3.5 Sonnet there is our current state-of-the-art model, considerably outperforming OpenAI's GPT-4o on the GPQA. And you can read much more about this at LifeArchitect.ai/mapping, where I go into detail on how we came up with this, some of the notes, some of the conclusions. There's a PDF copy and ping copy of the visualization available, and I'm looking forward to progressing this as our frontier models are released through 2024, 2025, and 2026. I'm sure we'll be hitting 80% on the GPQA and hitting ceilings for both the MMLU and MMLU-Pro. There's a table that I worked with Claude 3.5 Sonnet on generating that maps scores between the MMLU, MMLU-Pro, and GPQA. It's fairly accurate. There's a fair error margin in there for a number of reasons, probably plus or minus 5% in the final scores, and that's because there's some variation between how labs test on these different benchmarks. Do they provide the model with 5 best practice examples before they give it its first question? Do they use majority 32, so they're actually allowing it to give 32 different responses and picking the best ones? Or are they just doing something very funky? And Microsoft and OpenAI and Google have all done some pretty funky prompting to get their scores up. We do want to find benchmarks that have all been run by the same lab. That's a little bit difficult to find, so this is the best we've got at the moment in terms of correlation. Claude 3.5 Sonnet also put together this chart for us. So this is MMLU, MMLU-Pro, and GPQA mapped together. It's a little bit interactive, so you can turn off the different benchmarks or just see MMLU versus GPQA across some of the big frontier models over the last few years. We note that the benchmark results are from primary sources, and you can see all of those in my models table. That's a publicly available comprehensive database on over 400 large language models, non-derivative large language models, so I don't include the tens of thousands of llama derivatives. If you'd like to go and check my working, you're more than welcome to. We go all the way back to 2017 when the original Transformers came out. But obviously for this correlation, we're only using those that have scores in all 3 of the major benchmarks. We have some discussions on the uncontroversially correct or objectively correct ceilings for each of the benchmarks. MMLU, I reckon 90%. The team behind GPQA say it's about 80%, just because there was some argument between the PhD experts on what the correct answer could be. These tests are very, very difficult to design, as I've found out before. IQ results by Professor David Rosado, including replication by clinical psychologist Ika Ravainen, as well as error bar discussions, and then the conclusions. And this is a pretty big conclusion. Parameters and tokens trained are no longer a precise indicator of power. You might remember inside my models table, I have the AL score available, which is calculation of tokens and parameters. The higher the number of parameters and tokens, the higher the AL score, but we're now seeing 8 billion parameter models outperforming 2,000 billion parameter models. Really shocking stuff. That's gonna be some proprietary secret sauce as implemented by these major labs. It'll include pruning, it'll include compression that we know about, but it really puts some questions around the latest regulations, including the Biden AI Executive Order and the AI Acts, where they're saying if you use this amount of compute, you need to report to us. Well, this amount of compute might be too high for what we're currently using. For example, was GPT-4o Mini really using 10 septillion flops? Did it really cost $7 million to report to the EU or $70 million to report to Biden? Or could some open source lab go and do this for 6 figures and have a frontier model? Really interesting questions. I'm not making any final conclusions there. But it's certainly an interesting discussion. I am concerned that we're hitting the ceiling of what our smartest humans can design. AI is now outperforming our PhD level test designers. And we've been heading this way very quickly since I first reported this back in 2020 and 2021. All of this reminds me of those speed climbers from the Olympics. Here's a quick glance at some. AI is bounding ahead of what we're able to comprehend. And to me, that's exciting. For humanity, that should be exciting, but obviously there are some concerns as well. Love to invite you to join into my monthly analysis of what's going on in the world of artificial intelligence. You'll be joining major players from Microsoft, Google, Rand, Berkeley, and all the rest of that. That's LifeArchitect.ai/memo.
Yeah. Did you get that memo?
Yeah, I got the memo.
Get the inside look as AI models are embodied into humanoids. AI's IQ increases to nearly perfect, and bleeding edge use cases expand to the entire world.
Yeah. Didn't you get that memo?
Editions are sent to subscribers at Fortune 500s, major governments, and people like you. LifeArchitect.ai/memo.
I have the memo.